Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dutiful Future. Today, I have a very special, if not the most special guest that we've ever had on the show so far. I have with me BBC Newsnight's policy editor and former professional of Sky News fame, Lewis Goodall. Lewis, hello.
Hello. I have dread to think who else you've had on if I'm your most special guest, but the only way is up.
I've had some politics students. I've had some history students.
Well, there you go. Gosh. Well, I'm glad to follow in their footsteps.
You've truly joined the Hall of Fame.
Well, it's terrific. Gosh.
So, Lewis here also.
Why did I agree to do this again?
Lewis, you also have a fantastic book that I've been listening to called The Strange Death and Rebirth of the Labour Party, Left for Dead, of course. Basically all about the Labour Party and its developments over the last few years. And today I've got you on for a quick chat about journalism, politics, and then maybe, if we've got time, a little bit about the Labour Party. And but I guess a bit of an update on your book, since things have...
I know, but just changed, of course, it's still worth buying. Of course, just might be a little bit out of date, but still some great nuggets. Yeah.
So first question is definitely
got to do something in lockdown, haven't we?
And one of those things should be buying and listening to Lewis Goodall's book.
Absolutely, yeah. Once the grouting is done.
So, Lewis, first question. I'm sure you get this one quite a lot. How would you describe the relationship between a political journalist and, mainstream politics? Is it something which is far more reciprocal than most people think, or is it, you're two very separate entities and it's almost like a battle between you?
Someone once said that the relationship between a journalist and a politician should be akin between a dog and a lamppost. And I suppose to some extent there's a bit of that, although that is a bit of a fantasy in the sense that I think different journalists do it in different ways. Like there are different sorts of journalists and political journalists in particular. So, there are some journalists who are very source reliant. Particularly political, sort of politician sources. There are some journalists like that. They sort of do almost a sort of chronicle of they're almost like a court chronicler in some ways. They sort of chronicle what's going on in sort of a particular political court, whether it's Downing Street or the Labour Party. And I think by definition, they calibrate it themselves. But I think by definition, those journalists probably are a little bit more. They're more embedded with their sources. They're probably less likely to sort of call them out in a sort of huge way or whatever it is. I don't think I'm probably one of those. I think I'm a little bit more probably polemic in some ways, in the way that I approach things. But none of them are any more or less legitimate than the other. You need, sort of journalism should be a kind of rich meadow in some ways, with sort of different sorts of flowers and lots of different sort of plants. And, people go to different people for different things. And I think that's fine. I think that's perfectly legitimate. So I think different journalists do it in different ways. I don't think that it's very helpful, I think, in general, though. And I think relatively few journalists are. I think some might be, but I think most would tend to stay away from being friends with politicians. I wouldn't say I'm not friends with any politicians. I wouldn't socialize with politicians. I wouldn't, go round to their houses for dinner. Some people have done that and things like that in the past. But, I have acquaintances with politicians. I'm very friendly with certain politicians that, and there are certainly lots of politicians I like and respect. But I think once you're getting into sort of friendship, I think that inevitably, I think that's just very, very difficult in terms of, the sort of relationship that you have. I just don't think you can really sustain that.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever get concerned with almost like a sort of, wag the dog style situation where if you were to get too close, you get involved in these sort of sources and connections, that it becomes either your actions influencing them too much, or what they are telling or feeding you is, what they are hoping to try and portray rather than the reality?
Well, I think that inevitably you're always influencing each other. I mean, the political world in particular is very small. It's been made smaller, even smaller in some ways in recent years by the sort of advent of Twitter in particular. The Westminster Village is there for all to see on Twitter day in, day out, people interacting with each other, talking to each other. I often get politicians sort of say to me, saying, "Oh, I saw you tweet this," or "I saw you say that," and vice versa. So you're often you're inevitably, even if you don't intend to, influencing each other all the time. Is that a problem? I don't know. I just think it's the way it is. I don't think there's that much point sort of expending too much capacity. There's certainly a problem in general with sort of, and I think this is particularly acute in the British system, actually, of the British media and political class are unusually symbiotic and unusually connected. Actually, if you go to other countries, say, the United States, for example, there's actually a much bigger division between the media class and the political class. It's much rarer, for example, to have sort of leading journalists become politicians or sort of be very, very close in this sort of social circle of senior politicians. Very, very common in the UK. One thinks of, for example, Michael Gove. He was a very prominent leading Times journalist, ended up, becoming was a sort of close friend of the Camerons. Cameron once said, come into Parliament, found him a seat, and next thing you know, he's been in cabinet for 10 years. George Osborne went the other way. He became an editor of a newspaper. Again, unimaginable in the United States. So I think that there is a very strong nexus between in the British political and media classes. I don't think that's especially healthy in a lot of ways. But it is undoubtedly there, and I do think it's something that we've got to be aware of, because in the end you have the same sort of people occupying these two things, these two sort of what probably should be quite separate spheres, but end up being very, very connected and symbiotic. And I think the problems of groupthink and so on are well documented. So I think it is a bit of a problem, and it's something that Britain has particularly acutely.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the time I think it's an important topic to sort of discuss, because there's concerns of this sort of relationship then trying to translate over to the public. It's like a revolving door situation. And earlier today you tweeted a photo of some text from your mum saying,
love her.
If I quote, why don't these bloody journalists ask these sort of questions instead of asking the same things? And I think it's a question which a lot of people
trolling me, basically,
And I think
Cheers, Mum.
And I think I had to bring it up. I couldn't help myself.
Yeah.
And I think it's a question that a lot of people sort of, a lot of the general public feel, and that there's a gap between journalism and the sort of the general daily life. Do you think that sort of attitude of why are these politicians asking the same thing? Why aren't they getting into the real questions? Is that a sort of thing that you would say is a recognizable problem, or is this sort of a kind of a miscommunication, or like a lack of conversation between the public and the sphere?
Well, God, I mean, there's so many layers to that. I mean, it depends what you're talking about. I mean, if you're talking about coronavirus, sorry, that's
totally fine.
That's just my house just slowly falling apart. If you're talking about coronavirus, then I think certainly there's some questions around that are, I think you can unpack that in lots of different ways. Generally speaking, there certainly is. Journalists, particularly sort of political journalists, which is a bit I know best, tend to think a bit as a pack. And it's not just a group think thing, although that certainly is a sort of bit of a problem, as I've said. It's also a kind of the lobby, which is a sort of the sort of group of political journalists who work in Westminster. They have something called a lobby pass, which allows them to sort of go freely across Parliament and so on. They meet the Prime Minister's spokesman twice a day. They ask him questions and so on. It tends to work as a bit of a pack. One asks about one story, then someone will develop it in some way. They get a line on the same story, it'll develop, and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's a bit like and that can be really good and it can work really well. Sometimes I think it can be a bit like a rolling stone gathering moss. Sort of the stone's going and you're getting a load, the moss is gathering, but maybe no one can quite remember why the stone's rolling in the first place. What we're actually asking about. Sometimes, Westminster can get obsessed with sort of actually very, very trivial matters or issues that are aligned because we say they're aligned, but actually does it really matter that much? Okay, we can write it up into some copy, or I can do a live about it or whatever. But when we step back, is it that important? There's a lot of trivia like that. So that's certainly potentially an issue. As regards coronavirus, I think it's potentially there are sort of two issues at play there. One of them good, maybe one of them not so good. One of them that's not so good is probably, I think, one of the things that maybe if we, and this is not an accusation at anyone in particular, it goes all broadcasters, whatever. I think it's certainly true to say that one of the impacts of Brexit meant that political correspondents, myself included, have been so dominant in our discourse for ages, right? We've become the sort of, I mean, I'd hate to use the word, we've become very, very central in sort of telling that story. We've had politics, crazy politics for so long. And it's meant that certainly as broadcasters, I suspect for newspapers as well, that the sort of first lever, I remember when I was at Sky, we would get calls, even on the very few days, say on a Saturday morning, when there wasn't that much political news around, would get calls from Australia, where Sky News sort of HQ, and say, well, we need a story out of Millbank. And we'd say, well, to be honest, there's not much around. Say, no, but we need one, because they've been so accustomed to sort of pulling the politics lever for so long. And I do think going into coronavirus, having just had the general election, the great sort of climax of the Brexit story in December 2019, do you think that we went into coronavirus, and I say I include myself in this, pulling on politics levers and pulling on politics journalists, the politics journalist lever, if you like, politics journalism, and expecting us, and we expect ourselves, to be able to sort of drive this story? In many ways, and I've said this before quite openly, and I'll say it again now, there are certain elements of this story that I do not feel, as a journalist, particularly well equipped to interrogate. I'm not a scientist. I'm a history graduate, history politics. I'm not a scientist. I don't really understand the epidemiology any better than a reasonably intelligent person would. I can speak to scientists. I can phone scientists up. They can tell me things, but I don't have the ability to really contextualize or scrutinize that. I'm just going on what they say. And by the way, you can phone two different scientists and they'll tell you two different things, because there's no such thing as the science, actually. Particularly in something like this with a new disease, it's very contested. So this is a long way of saying that I think that actually we as politics journalists probably have to stand back a little bit, and I think that and let some of the science journalists and health journalists and whatever maybe tell this story a bit more. That's not to say that we shouldn't be involved. There are huge political questions, and there are loads of, what I've been trying to specialize on in terms of my own reporting about this is what's the impact it's having on public services, in care homes, in social services, on the economy. Because this stuff I understand, right? This is my bread and butter. I understand this stuff. What will the political impacts be? This I love. The science stuff, not so much. So I think that's the sort of slightly, maybe something for us to think about journalistically. I think that the sort of premise of your question, though, and I see this a lot on Twitter, is to say, why are journalists asking about this when actually the public want to know about this? Mm-hmm. Well, that might be true sometimes when we're sort of pursuing some of the pack mentality stuff that I've talked about, but sometimes we might ask questions that are actually in the public interest, but the public might not be interested in them yet. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask the questions. Just because the public aren't interested at that moment doesn't mean it's not in the public interest to ask about it. So, for example, there's a big, we've just had today, as we're speaking, nearly 1,000 people die in the UK of coronavirus. Now, there are some people on Twitter and out there who say that journalists shouldn't be asking about that, because what we should really be asking is about, sort of pulling behind the government, big national effort. Well, no, actually, now is the time to ask. If the time isn't now to ask these crucial questions, when will be? So sometimes, although we've got a dual role as journalists, yes, we've got to ask the questions the public want asked, but we also need to ask the questions that the public might not know they want asked yet. That's also a dual job, and that can be a difficult thing to balance, but we've got to do it.
That was going to be my next question, actually, was around specifically a crisis such as COVID-19. Do you yourself, or do you ever feel like this sort of pressure during a crisis such as this to sort of be kinder to the government, or sort of in that sort of call for unity where it's like, oh, why are you reporting the negatives? We're trying to band together here. Do you ever feel that sort of pressure around when you are reporting on these sort of issues?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I found it. I think we've all found this hard in this virus, much harder than during, say, Brexit, for example, because Brexit was a classic political problem in many ways. You were either for or against it, and that's it. And we could navigate. I mean, it was difficult to navigate for other reasons, but it was what it was. No one's pro-coronavirus, obviously, by definition, or at least I hope.
Hopefully.
There probably are a few demented individuals on Twitter who are sort of, some Russian bots. But in general, generally speaking, no one is pro-coronavirus, of course. And so clearly, and in many ways, it's been a very positive thing that we've seen the country rally together. Everyone obviously wants to get through this. Everyone is doing their bit in the main. And clearly, as we've seen in terms of polls across Western governments, there's been a big rallying towards incumbents in the early stage of this crisis. Whether that holds remains to be seen, but that's what we've seen so far. And there is certainly an element where, one is also very conscious of, as well as a journalist, my God, ministers and whatever, I have no doubt whatsoever that they are trying their absolute best. I'm sure that Matt Hancock has probably aged 20 years, mentally, physically in the last sort of 4 weeks. I have no doubt the Prime Minister was also working extremely hard before he went into intensive care and whatever. But that said, it is still our obligation, and we have to calibrate it correctly, to ask questions about what is going on. Because as we've seen, as I said, even just today, we are now, even though obviously the country wants to pull together, we are clearly heading towards a situation where the United Kingdom could well end up having the worst outbreak in Western Europe or in Europe in terms of death rates. We're now had more deaths per day, on 2 days in a row as we're speaking, recording this, than Italy and Spain have done. And clearly there are big questions to be asked, policy questions to be asked about how the government responded in the early part of this crisis. What impact the Prime Minister being out of action has had. Again, that's been very difficult. I got quite a bit of criticism earlier this week from people on Twitter. Inevitably, my first reaction when the Prime Minister was announced he was in intensive care. Obviously, as a human, one feels for him and one hopes that he pulls through. Of course, and it would be so traumatic for the country if he didn't. Nonetheless, to be honest, we all know that as a political journalist, my main concern about Boris Johnson as a journalist being unwell or potentially dying is what impact does that have on us politically? What impact does that have on the coronavirus? Because although obviously it would be a tragedy if Boris Johnson died if he were just an ordinary individual, every death is a tragedy. The reason he's important is because he's Prime Minister. And he has got to try and navigate us through this crisis. So my instant reaction was to say, what does this mean? Will there be an acting Prime Minister? Will the Prime Minister have to temporarily resign? What does this mean constitutionally? And a lot of people said, how dare you, should, there's a time and a place. But actually I say no. I mean, no, obviously it goes without saying. And indeed I did say, let's hope he gets better. But actually what matters far more is all the other people in all the hospitals across the country who, to be honest, what the Prime Minister does and what the government does affects them, and that is more important than the health of any individual. So I think journalistic, it's a tightrope. It is difficult to calibrate, but sometimes you just got to be brave about it, I think.
So on that specific issue, do you see your role in journalism as more of a sort of fact finder, where your job is to sort of get as much information as possible and give it to the public so they can absorb it? Or is it more of a sort of almost like an advisory role to the public, or more of like, a prodding role to the government to try and, get big stories?
Oh, it's probably a bit of all of them, really, and it depends on the story as well. It depends on the story. There is an argument to say that in the pandemic, certainly in the early stages of this pandemic, that journalists, almost, particularly perhaps the BBC and other broadcasters, almost become a sort of information service. And that is an important role of broadcasters, particularly for the BBC. But then again, the BBC is a very big organisation. What we at Newsnight do will be very different. Again, going back to that hackneyed meadow analogy, will be very different than, say, what the 10 o'clock news does. 10 o'clock news or 6 o'clock news in a situation like this, they basically are telling you what's happened, what you should do, all those sort of things. At Newsnight, did very well with the Brexit crisis, doing well with this crisis, because they're both such sort of profound things that you need that space to just hang on a minute. Well, this has happened, but why is this happening? And perhaps this should be happening a bit differently. And actually, why haven't we done the testing? Why haven't we done the testing like Germany has done? Oh, and actually, why didn't we order PPE 3 weeks ago when we knew this was happening? And, why aren't we doing contact tracing like the South Koreans are? And also, are we ever going to get antibody tests? And it goes on and on and on and on. And so we've got that space because we don't have to sort of go through. I mean, it's really difficult, I think, for my colleagues on the 10 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news, on ITV, BBC, even Channel 4, because, there's so much news happening that it's actually hard to just get through it all. But we don't kind of have to do that in the same way. So it depends. It depends. It depends on what sort of where you are, where you work. If I was still at Sky News, I would probably be doing something slightly different to what I'm doing now, because I would be more sort of rolling news, keeping people up to date. Yes, asking big questions for sure, but doing that probably a little bit in a more circumscribed way. Still keeping people more up to date, sort of rolling than what I am now. So you have to, as journalists, you sort of mold your offer around according to the moment you're in and the outlet you're working in as well.
So pivoting from the government to the opposition now, I think it's safe to say you're a bit of an expert on the Labour Party, basically throughout its history. And I think one of the greatest questions we have, I guess, post coronavirus is, we're in now the Keir Starmer age. How do
Yeah.
you think that this will shape up, and do you think that COVID will play any sort of big impact upon his sort of his leadership of the Labour Party? Will it influence his policies, the way he acts, or the way he interacts with the government?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when you think about I went to Keir Starmer's first launch event in Manchester at the start of January. I mean, again, sort of, it seems an alien world in so many ways now. It was absolutely packed to the rafters, literally everyone cheek by jowl.
Shaking hands, having a great time.
I know, yeah, exactly. And, no one had even heard of coronavirus, or at least, no one outside Wuhan and the WHO. Perhaps we should have done, maybe that's something again to look at in the future. But so yeah, I mean, it's absolutely transformative. It's absolutely transformative in so many ways. I mean, it's hard to distill in the ways in which it's going to be. I mean, just a few examples. In a typical, had he become the leader of the opposition in a typical situation, it's going to pose a lot of challenges. Normally, he'd either be in Parliament, he'd be able to do PMQs. That's not going to be able to happen. All these ways, the typical ways that leaders of the opposition introduces themselves to the public, will not be available to him. He won't be able to do rallies. Normally, he would be doing a week-long series of photo opportunities, preparing for the May local elections, all of that sort of thing. And then on top of all of that, he's also got the problem basically times 1,000 that you and I were just talking about me and about journalists, which is, you're the Her Majesty's loyal opposition. Everyone's running around the government. You don't want to be seen carping from the sidelines, but it is potentially, and you've got to be seen to be constructive. But at the same time, if it comes to be seen that Britain has made mistakes and the British government has made mistakes, then he's got to be seen to be offering opposition and asking why. And that's really hard to calibrate. It's even harder to calibrate, by the way, when the Prime Minister's been in intensive care and everyone wants him to pull through. So it's bloody difficult for them, I think. And it's also going to be difficult as well, because beyond coronavirus, where do you even begin? It's like if British politics was a jigsaw and it had already been thrown up in the air by Brexit and the general election result. It's been thrown up again and no one even knows where the pieces are now, because we don't know where they'll settle. I mean, on the one hand, one sort of instinctively thinks you could say, well, this is helpful for the Labour Party because clearly we are heading into a period of a bigger state. A lot of people on the left of the Labour Party feel vindicated because, the stuff that the government is now doing puts all of the sort of, even the Corbyn manifesto of 2019 in many ways, makes it look like small beer. But then on the other hand, if we come out of this crisis and you've got a Conservative Party which is actually spending is having a huge state, doing all the things that the Labour Party instinctively would want, where does the Labour Party go? We just don't know. We just don't know how politically this is going to play out. It could end up being, if the government ends up being seen to have totally mishandled it, then it could be like Black Wednesday for the Labour Party. The Labour Party might never look back, but we just don't know at the moment. So I just think that all he can really do is wait, try and look as statesman-like as possible, which is something that he can do. He's very well attuned to that, and see what happens.
Do you think there could be comparisons drawn between sort of the Iraq war times, where the Tory party, obviously vice versa here, was struggling to sort of position themselves in an opposition manner whilst also trying to be, united under this sort of banner? Do you think that this is something potentially Keir Starmer could try and learn from in trying to find that middle ground of trying to seem not just, being opposite for the opposition's sake, but also trying to be, constructive and show that he is an alternative in some sense?
Well, I mean, obviously, you probably wouldn't hope that the analogy sort of holds, because obviously Ian Duncan Smith was the leader of the Tory party in the Iraq War, so he'll be hoping that, that it doesn't hold in that respect. But, well, yeah, I suppose there are some parallels in the sense that, yes, it was difficult for, I suppose, the Tories at that time to really differentiate themselves over that sort of key issue. But look, I think I wrote when it wasn't at the very start of this contest or towards the start of the Labour Party contest, I wrote that Keir Starmer was basically the break glass in case of emergency candidate. He was the one that the Labour Party pulled, the lever that the Labour Party pulled when they were scared and basically hoping, had no real idea what the Labour Party should do now, but basically hopes that there's a huge crisis and Johnson screws it up. That's what basically Starmer. That's basically what the Starmer as a candidate represented. I mean, we have had a huge. I mean, this is a crime. I mean, when I wrote that, I could not possibly have envisaged. I thought there might be a recession at some point over the next few years. You know, Johnson might sort of screw something up. There might be seen to be incompetent about something. You know, who knows? No, I could not imagine anything on this scale. So, my word, we have got a crisis and a half times 1,000. Whether culpability comes to be attached to the Conservative Party or for how it's handled is a totally different question. And indeed, it could go totally the other way. It could well be that even if we end up with the worst death rates or whatever in Western Europe, it could still be it could entirely be that the public actually doesn't blame the Conservative Party, and far from it, actually thinks they've done a very good job and feels sorry for the Prime Minister having to battle through it. You know, during that time, no one could have done it better, kind of thing. In which case, probably the best hope for Starmer is that we sort of forget about this and we sort of move on. But so, as I say, I think ultimately he's kind of just got to wait. He's just got to wait and to see what happens. But it's a really difficult thing to calibrate. There's no two ways about it.
So unfortunately, we are starting to run out of time here. So I would be very angry at myself if I didn't ask this question that I have here.
Yeah.
For budding journalists like myself, what would you say is the number one thing that you've had to learn or improve at since getting into these sort of positions? What is the one sort of skill or lesson you've had to develop or learn over this time?
Well, certainly in terms of lesson, I think that the thing that I learned sort of a few years ago is that and there's a great saying from the great Winston Churchill once said, love the quote, which is that success is the definition of success is the ability to go from one failure to the other without losing your enthusiasm. And that is absolutely, I mean, honestly, I mean, he was a bit of an old duffer, God love him in some ways, but he was you know, he was so right about that. You know, you know, if you particularly in journalism, and probably any competitive profession really, but particularly journalism, it is so dispiriting. There are so many people who probably want to like put you down. There's relatively few jobs. Who knows what the employment situation is going to be like coming out of this, particularly in journalism. I mean, my word, you know, so many jobs being lost hand over fist, particularly in newspapers and so on. But if you can basically just keep going through gritted teeth and you can just keep enduring, and every knockback you get, which you will get loads of, and you can just keep going and just say to yourself, no, and not allow it to inhibit or to your own enthusiasm or to convince yourself that you don't deserve it or that you're not good enough. Because there are lots of people, journalists are very bad managers. Like, they are very bad managers. The skills that make you a good journalist, particularly in TV journalism, I think about all journalism, but if in TV or in journalism or whatever, the sort of people who are good at that, you need the sort of skills to be good at those sorts of things that often make you a very bad manager. You're probably a bit bolshy. You're probably a bit sort of you sort of think about number one, maybe. You sort of constantly sort of thinking about how to get ahead. You're probably a bit pushy. All those sort of things. Maybe not necessarily that concerned about the big, you know, the sort of wider team or whatever. Those are exactly the sort of things you need to be a good manager. You need to be concerned with all of those sort of things. And so, although it can happen, there aren't necessarily loads of people in the industry who are really pushing you to get ahead or willing you to get ahead. You can find them, and there are them. I don't want to make it seem like a really horrible profession because it's really not. And like, in particular with television journalism, it's a real team game as opposed to newspapers. So one of the things I love about it. So I don't want to give the wrong impression, but you need to remember that ultimately, if you can just keep going, you probably will get there. If you've got talent. And the other thing I'd say is that the really important thing is to have a passion, like, because I think sometimes people with journalism think, oh, I just need to be a bit of a jack of all trades and sort of do a bit of this and a bit of that. I think that's fine, but actually the thing that will mark you out to a boss or an employer is if you know loads about something and you have so passionate about it. You know, in my case, it was politics, but you know, it could be politics or business or sport or, you know, fashion or I don't know, whatever. Like, I mean, you know, gardening, you know, whatever. The chances are there's probably journalism for all those things, you know, construction magazine or whatever, you know, and if you have just like cornered that market and you just know more about it than maybe someone older than you or more experienced than you, an editor is going to turn around to you and going to turn around and be like, they've got something. They're really passionate. You can't replicate that. You can't duplicate that. And that will get you a job over someone who might be more experienced. But to be honest, experience, you get experience by doing it. You will learn. You can pick up all these things. What you can't replicate is guile, determination, and passion, and just bloody love of what you're doing. Because if you love something, like you're like me, I love politics. I cannot remember a time that I didn't think about politics. I can't, literally from when I was sort of 9, 10, whatever, I've thought about it pretty much every day. Well, yeah, every day of my life, on my lowest day and on my highest day, I've thought about it. And my job is kind of my hobby, and that's great. I mean, it can have pros, problems. It can be difficult to switch off and whatever. But it's brilliant. I don't feel like I'm going to work. I'm going to work and I'm basically spending it doing something I love and I'm fascinated by it. And it's just so much fun. It's just the best job in the world if you love it. And you can't, and that'll be the thing that keeps you going once you're in it, because you're like, why would I want to do anything else? Why would I want to do anything else? Why? It's not like a proper job. Do you know what I mean? So that's a long way winded way of saying that if you love something and you want to cover it, and you're the other thing about it is, particularly for if you want to work in, say, broadcast media, is that people often say to me, I love elections. I love elections so much. I can't explain to you why I love them. I just love them. Like some people love peanut butter. I love elections, and and people often say to me, I love your enthusiasm. I love your enthusiasm, and it's because you can't fake it, right? You can't fake it. People know, they can see it. I mean, there are lots of things I don't love. If I was sat broadcasting about hockey, I would not love it. I would look really bored. But they can see I just love elections, and that's infectious. And so it will mark you out, and you'll sort of get there. But as I say, it can be about anything at all.
Mm-hmm. Right then, Lewis, thank you so much for coming on.
It's all right. My pleasure.
I have a final message. All right, everyone follow Lewis on Twitter if you haven't already for some reason. At Lewis Goodall, at Lewis_Goodall, that is. Buy the book, Left 4 Dead.
Yes.
Buy it. It's very good.
I was about to say in all good bookshops, but actually there aren't any bookshops anymore. So
on all good online bookshops.
All good online bookshops. Go to an online bookshop. Keep them in business, folks.
And,
but before we go, how being a student? How is that at the moment? That must be really hard.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird time for being a student. It's not too bad for me because I'm a second year, so this year still isn't as important for me. But I actually have a podcast if you want to listen to it. A great.
I love listening to myself. Yeah,
a great journalist.
Got some good ideas.
A great journalist, a student journalist called Evian Swen. She wrote a great article about sort of the end, about how they've lost their last term and their graduation, and going into a terrible job market.
I was thinking about that the other day. It must be horrendous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely horrendous to and you've paid your tuition fees and
£9,000.
Yeah, and okay, it's not the university's fault, but it's just, I mean, you must just feel utterly robbed of that time.
Yeah. I think the real shame is going to the term and having fun. I think the University of Warwick, where I go, they've been pretty decent about how they've handled it. Like, they've been nice to our exams and things like that. But there's plenty of other universities, I think especially Oxford has been quite brutal so far on their students, basically not changing anything and saying, "Hey, you'll have a couple lessons online. Your exams are going to be the same. Bad luck."
Oh, that's not surprising.
That really is not a shame. It's a tough time, but let's be honest. If anyone's got the least right to complain in the world, it's probably the lucky university students, at home now. I think there's plenty more people in the world who I feel much more sorry for.
Well, maybe. Well, it's true, but as you say, but the thing is, you're paying for it, and secondly, and you'll be paying for it long after, long.
Especially if I get to journalism.
Well, exactly. But I also mean in the sense that this whole thing is going to cost a lot of money, a lot of money, the amount of debt that it's going to take. I don't mean student debt, I mean national debt to finance all this stuff. And, as the youngest members of the population, you can look forward to paying it off, not only your debt, but I'm going to stop because I'm going to depress you. And
I'm going to start crying on camera. It's fine. Yeah, I just don't think about it. So yeah, follow on Twitter, buy the book. Yes. And Lewis, if you ever need an intern, I make a good cup of tea. Right.
Honestly, you wouldn't want to be my intern. I would be a terrible boss. I will never, ever. I've never interviewed anyone. I've never had an employee, like someone work for me. I never want to, for all the reasons that I said earlier about journalists being bad managers.
If you ever need to, you can look out for number one. I'll be fine. I'll be quiet. Right. Thank you so much for coming on.
My
pleasure. Been great. Thank you so much.
Good luck.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Thank you very much.